for Hope. You're okay. At the Center for Hope, we do a couple of different things. We have support group meetings like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Crystal Meth Anonymous. And on a monthly basis, we have our attendance is right about 950 people attend those groups. We also do educational groups where Andra comes in and teaches a variety of subjects to people that are coming out of prison or are on a specialty court like drug court or the wood court or in the criminal justice system. And then lastly, Andra and I do a lot of suicide prevention training together. We've probably trained over maybe 1,500 people together. And I just want you to know, again, it's always a privilege to be able to do this. If at any time, like Tanny explained, if you get triggered or something doesn't feel right, please let us know. This can be a sensitive subject, but it's one well worth attending. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andra. Like I said, Andra and I have been working quite a bit together, and it's always a pleasure working with her. So. Let me just pull this off. Okay, better? Lots better. Okay. All right. I'll try not to trip. Okay. If I may just reiterate, Nancy and I do a lot of these trainings together. We're also both assist suicide intervention trainers. It's a full 2-day training. And whenever we deal with these topics, we recognize the sensitivity. We don't know what your experiences have been or what you might be carrying. If somebody does need to leave in the middle of the training, if you could just kind of catch Nancy's eye and make sure you give her a thumbs up. We don't want to trail you to the bathroom or something like that would be weird, but we definitely don't want somebody to leave because they're triggered and not have support. Okay, so if we can just kind of make sure that we're very attentive to that, that would be great. Really appreciate having you all having us here today. This is a real passion project for us. We've been very actively doing a number of trainings. And we both have our own set of experiences with the topic that kind of have awakened this passion. So the training today will cover these 5 learning areas. They're not all going to be covered at equal length, but just to kind of indicate, you'll see there that we're going to talk about the relationship or the comparison between QPR and CPR. The only reason for that topic is to kind of situate you. What role am I playing when I use the skills that we'll be talking about today? And you'll find that there is a strong parallel to CPR in the sense of the purpose that you're trying to serve with the skills. So we'll kind of try to clarify that. With this issue, there's a lot of uncertainty about what to do, what to talk about, what not to talk about, how to engage someone, how not to engage someone. I recognize that those things are very difficult and important for people. And so hopefully that will just be a little bit of a clarifying component when we go through that. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. So kind of in the, yeah, I do wander. I will plant myself in a spot. Loss and impact will be brief with this topic. It will be a hard section because we look at numbers in Idaho and our numbers are too high. But we are hoping that we can reframe the way that we think about those numbers in order to empower ourselves to try to bring them down. Okay, it's really there. We're capable of bringing the numbers down, and it will be important that we kind of grasp that as we look at that. The next section is beliefs and barriers. We'll be brief with this as well, but with beliefs and barriers, the goal is to kind of invite self-reflection so that we can sort of consider what our beliefs and attitudes toward the topic might be, toward individuals who struggle with thoughts of suicide might be, because the way we think about it is going to have a big impact on how we engage it. And so we need to really examine that. There is research to show that some of the common beliefs and attitudes aren't really grounded. They're not accurate. And so sometimes by correcting misconceptions, we can empower ourselves to make a significant difference for the positive. And then the last 2 are the more substantive sections as far as the actual skill sets go. Pathways and protections will refer to risk factors that can potentially put someone on a pathway toward thoughts of suicide. Protections would be different relationships, resources, and practices that we can adopt that kind of buoy us up and maybe strengthen our will to live or give us some kind of buffer between the hard things that happen and our own feelings of hope or despair. Okay, and so that's what we're looking for there. And then skills in action, to be super practical. The skills in action section in the simplest language is see, say, do. And so if someone were having thoughts of suicide, would I see it? We hope to improve our understanding of that today. If I did think that I saw something of concern, would I know what to say? Like, would I know how to ask about thoughts of suicide? And if I did say it, if I did ask about thoughts of suicide and the answer was yes, would I know what to do? Okay, and so very practical skill set intended to be action oriented, and we'll cover those things today as well. Okay, so that's kind of what we'll go through today in our time together. Again, I really appreciate you being here. I am going to ask a question. You can't really see it here. At the bottom of this slide, don't worry about it. It's no big deal. I can say it. At the bottom of the slide, you see a number. So on the pre-training survey that you just completed, we started that pre-training survey in late March of 2020, and we now have over 1,800 people on the pre-training survey. And out of 1,800 people, and they're from around the state of Idaho, a variety of settings and sectors, lots of, anything from incarceration facilities to religious groups to public health to schools, lots and lots of diversity with the respondents, but a lot of consistency in the answers. It seems not to matter terribly which demographic group you're talking about in terms of the responses to the questions that you just answered. But we have about 93%, almost 93% out of the 1,800 people, more than, who have taken this survey are saying, yes, I have met or known someone who struggles with thoughts of suicide. Sometimes people are including themselves in that answer. Sometimes they're referring to others. But what that tells me is that we're in this together. It doesn't matter if I'm a counselor. It doesn't matter if I'm in any health-related field. We're in it, and we're in it together. And there's a tremendous amount of good that we can do for each other if we acquire these skills. Okay, so if we were in a longer session or we had a different setting, a little bit of a different setting, I'd probably ask you to raise your hand if you answered yes to that. And then Nancy gave me the good idea of asking, and how many of you have been trained? And in a typical setting, almost everybody raises their hand when I ask if you answered yes to that question. And then almost everybody puts their hand down when I ask if you've been trained. And that's why this is such a critical training, because how to respond to such a significant kind of challenge isn't just innate in us. It's not just something that we automatically know what to do with. And so this training becomes extremely significant. Okay, before we go to the next slide, let me just indicate a couple of things. This is a training that's on, it's put on the National Registry of Evidence-Based Trainings. It is SAMHSA recommended, and the state of Idaho has made a significant investment in this training. Okay, the state of Idaho has a suicide prevention plan that runs through 2023, but in that plan, they have a really cool big objective. And the big objective is to bring our suicide rate down by 20% by 2025, okay? And we're always in the top 10 states of the nation. Sometimes we're 5th, sometimes we're 8th, but we have some real challenges around that issue, and it's a lot of loss and a lot of pain. And that's a really cool goal, to bring the rate down by 20%. And the supporting goals there include this training. Like, one of the big goals is to take this type of information across sectors and settings, that's the language of the plan, throughout the state of Idaho. And why that's so important, I think, will become a little more clear when we get into the comparison between QPR and CPR. So we're going to go there now. All right, so that's our next one. And we could just go one more. That's just kind of the introductory slide. Okay, so what you see on here, the QPR Institute is really kind of pushing this comparison, and I think with good reason. So let's just start with CPR for a moment, okay? If I'm talking about CPR, as you're well aware, if I were in this room and I was CPR trained and somebody went into a cardiac crisis, I would recognize it. I would know that I had relevant skills, and I would take action to try to save that life, to try to bridge the gap between crisis and help, with the goal of giving that individual life beyond crisis, that crisis isn't the end point, It is something that has to be navigated, and there's a lot of life after the crisis. And that's why I would use CPR. And if I were in a really big space, the more people who knew CPR, the likelier it would be that I got the help I needed, right? We could do a teamwork thing, we'd recognize it, we could communicate with each other. And I would be using those skills until more qualified help arrives. That's what I would use it for. I would also know what I'm not doing. I'm not going to jump into the ambulance and go with the paramedics to the hospital. I'm not going to be the person who greets the individual in the emergency room. So I know what to do with CPR, and I also know what isn't my job. Okay, and that clarity creates confidence that enables me to act. I'm more likely to take action because I know what the skills are, I know how to use them, and I know what I'm not responsible for. So I can now play my role. The goal here with QPR is identical. What about the life-threatening crisis that isn't visible like that? What about the emotional despair? What about the individual who is, facing eviction, feels very uncertain about how to take care of his or her family, is weighed down by guilt about the kids? What about that? To the point of hopelessness, to the point of maybe accepting the illusion that people would be better off without you. That's what some people with thoughts of suicide are facing. And the question is, who's there to be the bridge for them? And that's the goal of the skills that we're focusing on today, is to create bridge skills. So let me quickly tell you what QPR stands for. Q stands for question. We've got to get comfortable saying the word. We've got to be able to specifically ask about suicide. Are you having thoughts of suicide? Needs to become a question that we become comfortable asking, because we need the information in order to be as helpful as we can be. Okay, so Q is question. P is persuade. We could also substitute the word invite if we wanted to. Maybe that feels a little more comfortable than persuasion for some of us. But the idea there is, if a person is in crisis, I'm hopeful that they'll choose to stay alive for now. Maybe that now is 10 minutes. Maybe it's an evening. Maybe it's more time than that. But I'm going to try to engage and communicate with them in such a way that they discover and reaffirm and recognize their reasons to choose to stay alive for now. And I also know they're in a lot of pain, so I'm hopeful that they'll choose to get help. Okay, so that's what I'm doing with the P, the persuade. Choose life for now, choose to seek help. And then refer would be, I need to be aware of some resources that I could then refer them to, that I could connect them to the help that they're willing to seek. Okay, and at that point, I want you to think about the bridge again. It's a handoff skill, just like CPR. I'm trying to sustain life long enough for more expert help to take over. And similarly, with QPR, I'm trying to sustain life until the greater help that individual needs can kick in and can take over. It's a handoff skill. Doesn't mean I quit being their friend, doesn't mean I quit, expressing support. I'm still a safe connection, but my application of the skills stops when I can connect them to more expert help or more qualified help. So that's what QPR stands for. It's a bridge. It's a bridge skill, it's a life-saving skill, and it's critical. Now, if we can go to the next slide really quickly. Before we move into our big next topic, let me just make a point. There's a very interesting piece of research that's out there that I keep kind of puzzling over. The research shows something very interesting. It's also kind of counterintuitive unless I've been in that headspace. Okay, so the research shows that the vast majority of individuals who have made a serious suicide attempt and survived it, and it also indicates that the vast majority of individuals who have died by suicide would fit this same description, that they don't really want to die, the vast majority. And if I'm not in that headspace, that sounds counterintuitive. If you don't want to die, why are you thinking about suicide? So if I'm not there, if I'm not feeling that, it's not familiar to me. It's easy to miss through no fault of my own. It's easy to miss the gravity of the situation. It's easy to miss what's really on the table because we don't recognize it. Okay, and there's nothing that's blaming about that. It's just, why would we? We don't have the experience. Okay, and so that difference becomes really important to note. So what is going on? It's not that the individual doesn't love their family. It's not that they don't still care. It's not that they have no feeling for those things. So what's happening? Why are they thinking about suicide? And the two factors that research shows are almost always present are pain and isolation. Okay, so there's a lot of pain, and it might be remorse, it might be guilt, it might be shame, misplaced. It might be feelings of unworthiness, of inadequacy. And these examples, I mean, there's a lot of little details that this can be. I teach, as you're aware from my bio, I teach on the BYU Idaho campus. I'm a faculty member. So I've had all kinds of conversations with students that have really been in despair over things like, I don't want to go on a mission and my parents really want me to, and I don't know how to talk to them about that. Or I'll just use an example. This week, I had a conversation with a student who after class asked if she could talk to me for a minute and said that she's bisexual and she just doesn't know, her mom's not talking to her. That was 2 days ago. Okay, LGBTQ stuff, huge pain, huge isolation. Maybe they have an addiction problem, a pornography addiction problem or a substance use problem, and they don't know who to talk to about it. And I'm just using examples from my campus because the campus has a culture that's very, religiously oriented. And so a lot of the people there, that's the way that they're trying to make sense of their lives. And it causes a lot of pain and isolation when they feel at odds with that culture. And it makes it complicated to sort it out and to get to clarity. Oh, okay, sorry. Here? Okay, you have to call me out on that because I don't really want to be seen, but that's all right. I'll stand here in the circle. So pain and isolation. I recently attended a big, it was a virtual one, but it was like a full day with a national expert, Dr. Red. And he used 3 words I'd like you to just kind of stick in your head because they're really helpful, I think. He said, it becomes very dangerous when these 3 feelings converge. When I start to feel unlovable, when the problem feels unsolvable, and when the pain has grown unbearable. So if you can just remember those words, unlovable, unsolvable, and unbearable. And when those feelings really, flare up together, the likelihood of someone struggling with thoughts of suicide is really high. Okay, and so when that happens, it's as if that person's in a tunnel. They're locked in a tunnel. Okay, a tunnel of pain and isolation. The tunnel is very apt to be pointed at the past, and the tunnel is very apt to be leaving the person with a feeling of no control. Okay, and so they're locked into this dark place. And that is why it is so important that we move from a position of being passive, because we're not sure what to do, to being active. Because if we can be active, we can create a feeling of connection that may end up being a life-saving connection. Just that feeling of not being so alone makes a huge difference. If I'm inside the tunnel, I might start to think that suicide is a solution. A solution to what? It stops the pain, and it stops me from being a burden on the people who care about me. Now, outside the tunnel, I would never say that's the case. Outside the tunnel, I would never say, oh, you're just a burden on me. But inside the tunnel, that's what it starts to maybe look like. Outside the tunnel, I would never say that suicide is a solution. Never. But inside the tunnel, I might start to think that way and get locked into that. And that's why it's so critical that we can communicate about this, because there is a way that, remember, that person very likely doesn't actually want to die. They want the pain to stop, and they want not to be a burden on others, and they don't know what to do. The problem feels unsolvable. Okay, so if we can kind of think of suicide as a pain and isolation problem, sometimes we can empower ourselves to make a very significant difference. And the willingness to reach out and connect about it becomes more plausible. So if we can skip to the next slide, this will be super brief on this one. Just to clarify then, this is not a training that is a treatment training. It's not a counseling training. It's a skills-based positive action training intended to bring hope, connection, and possibilities. Okay, that's what this training is. So if we can go to the next one, and then we'll go one more. Now, these numbers are hard to look at. Okay, this is the loss and impact section. I find this to be a very challenging slide to take in. Okay, so I may be standing in your way. Let me just kind of point it out here. These are the numbers in Idaho according to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention in 2020. And they're hard to see and to fathom. We're losing someone every day in our state. And maybe one of the hardest parts to see is at age 10 in the second leading cause of death. In our state, the second leading cause of death for individuals between the ages of 10 and 34 is suicide. Okay, this is really tough to see and to take in and to comprehend, I think. What you can see if you look through the whole slide, and if I may ask you, please reframe this, whatever you may be thinking, please frame this now and see if it changes your perception of it. Please frame it as throughout our lifespan, we are probably susceptible to feelings of pain and isolation. That's probably just a reality that we'll face throughout our lifespan. Okay, and our goal is to acquire skills that would bridge that gap between feelings of crisis due to pain and isolation and the recognition that life is possible and help is possible and there's more I can do and I'm not alone with this. That's what we're trying to learn to do. Okay, and if I may just invite you to do one more thing in your thoughts about this. The communication that we're going to be talking about today, the perceptions, the way of recognizing it, it's very other-centered. When I'm talking to someone, it is about them. I'm focused on them, not me, on them. And so if you think about that, the sources of pain and isolation for a 10-year-old would be really different than the sources of pain and isolation for a 27-year-old or a 33-year-old or a 52-year-old. So I have to, when I'm really concerned about someone, I have to shift my mindset and let it be very other-centered instead of being like, oh my gosh, your boyfriend broke up with you, you'll get over it, you'll be happy in 6 months. That's what happens when you're a teenager. You know, I mean, maybe that will turn out to be true, but it doesn't feel true to the person right then. And so I have to be able to recognize their meaning and experience, like what they're attaching to it in the moment, so that I can connect with them where they are. I need to find them where they are. Okay, so if we can scroll on, we also know that pain doesn't really stop when someone dies by suicide. Rather, it ripples outward, right? It becomes bigger for many other people. Stigma is a huge problem. If I don't know that I can talk about suicide, if I don't know if it's somehow taboo to even say the word or to name it, and I lose someone to suicide, what do I call the cause of death? How do I ask a friend to listen to me if I can't say the word? If I'm a friend wanting to help someone who's lost someone to suicide, how do I reach out in a way that's deeply meaningful if we can't even talk about what actually happened? Like we can't name it. If we could reduce the stigma surrounding this issue, we could help each other so much more readily. And the other thing that we need to be aware of is grief. Things look different through the lens of grief than they do otherwise. So Nancy and I recently completed a grief-informed practice training that was really powerful, but it reminded me of a student. I'll just be really quickly tell you this story. I had a student a few years ago. I was really looking forward to her being in my class. I'd had her twice before. She was always buoyant. She was always outgoing. She was always a high performer. She was a leader. She always made every class better. And so it was her last class before she graduated. And so I was really happy that she was going to be in it. But within the first 2 weeks of the semester, she lost a close friend and fellow BYU Idaho student to suicide. I was so thankful for the trainings that I've done because her behavior would have been easy to misinterpret. She started being really late to class, like she'd come in late all the time. Like sometimes even with only 10 minutes left in class, she would come in late. She started missing her deadlines. Her quality of work dipped. Okay, she was withdrawn. And if I hadn't thought about the fact that she was grieving, I would have thought, why are you so disrespectful? You can't just walk in this late all the time. It's disruptive. Why are you missing your deadlines? You think because it's your last semester, you can just coast to graduation? Like, what's the deal? You don't seem very committed to your work. Okay, you're not a very effective team member. You seem not to engage. That's what it would have looked like, absent an understanding of the fact that she was grieving. But through the lens of grief, it looked entirely different. It was, and I knew this was true. I am not going to miss class. Even I would rather stay in bed. I don't even feel motivated, but I'm not going to miss class. I'm going to make myself go, even if it's for the last 10 minutes. I will not miss an assignment, even if it's late. I don't care if my work is shoddy. I will not bail. I'm going to hand it in. That's what I was really watching, was strength and commitment, but it would have looked really different without thinking through the lens of grief. Okay, so this is happening to people. 1 out of 61 Americans is a survivor of a suicide loss, and the impact is real. It's long and hard and real. And the more we can recognize that, the more support that we can provide, the more hope we can bring, the fewer people will be struggling with pain and feeling very isolated at the same time. I can't make the pain go away, but I can be a connection that helps that person not feel isolated with it, not alone with it. Yeah, comment. Different, very different, and very important. So suicide loss survivor, meaning I have lost someone to suicide and I am left with that. Yeah, that's a great question. And that's what this number refers to. Yes, you're welcome. Thanks for asking. So to me, this is like 1 student in every 2 classes. And I don't know what that looks like to you, but it's a lot of people. And Nancy, if you remember, what was it? How many in our grief training? I'm gonna let you take the mic for 1 second.
1 in 16 kids will either lose a sibling or a parent by the time they're 18.
So 1 out of 16 kids in Idaho, any death. But the grief is real, right? And with suicides being high, a lot of those would be, but certainly not all of them, not even close to all of them. But that's one place, and every now and then when we get some good news, or there can be some good news, we should celebrate it in Idaho. So like nationally, it's 1 in 14. So we're better than the national average that way here, but still that's too high, right? Like 1 out of 16. So this grief stuff is real. And the point is, regardless of the reason for the loss, there is the high likelihood that the individual is going to feel pain and isolation after the loss. So those risk factors just end up abounding. Okay, if we can just go to the next one, and the next 2 switches will be really quick. If we can't talk to each other, I don't know if you know Brandi Carlile, but I'm suddenly thinking of her song, The Story. That's her big famous song. You got to have somebody to tell it to. Okay, we all have a story, but when we can't hear each other, when we can't connect, when we're not observant of that, we're not really a community. Like we're inhabiting the same geography, but we're not really a community with the full power of what a community can bring to people. But when we can, if we switch to the next one, when we can connect. We can learn to talk about these things. We can learn to see people slightly differently and maybe in a more compassionate way or just a more informed way. And when we do that, we can create safer homes. We can create safer classrooms, safer workplaces, it's within our power to do. And that's what's so beautiful about the state of Idaho suicide prevention plan. It's like, look, let's figure out how to bring this rate down. We are not just subject to it. We can do stuff about this. And it's also one of the reasons why I think Nancy and I feel it's such a privilege to provide these trainings, because we care so greatly about the information exchange, because we're working together here and it's awesome. It's awesome to be part of a teamwork effort on this. So if we go to the next one. Okay, and we can, yeah. Okay, so beliefs and barriers, just really quickly. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, on the next 2 slides, but I do want to just invite you. Many of us believe things that aren't actually consistent with the research. So like I said, this is on the National Registry of Evidence-Based Trainings. And all we want to do is kind of reflect upon our attitudes or beliefs or assumptions and see if they line up with the research. That's all we're trying to do, okay? So I want you to notice a few things. I don't know if you can read these, so I'm gonna read them out loud. It might be kind of hard to see them. So let me just read them out loud. These are identified as myths. And I recently heard a great definition of myth. The author of the book said, a myth is a belief that isn't true. Very simply, like I might really believe it. It might be a heartfelt belief with good intention, but the research doesn't have my back on it. So I'm at odds with the research. And it's better to recognize that stuff, because when we do, we can really empower ourselves. So let me just go through this. And on the second one, I'm going to ask you just to raise your hand on this and see. It would be fun if we could have the time to have a big discussion. We don't, but I would love to hear from you on this. So the first one is myth. No one can stop a suicide. It's inevitable. Now, I don't know if you've encountered that attitude or that belief before. Sometimes people do get exhausted by working with someone over a long, long period of time that they don't quite have an answer to. They don't know quite how to ease the pain or, stop the struggle. But the research shows that it's not true that it's inevitable. And please remember, the vast majority of people don't want to die. So if they don't want to die, then there's probably room for persuasion. There's room for influence, toward life. The second myth, and there's kind of a couple of variations of this one, so we'll kind of go through both of those. The way it's phrased in the QPR curriculum is that confronting a person about suicide will only make them angry and thus increase the risk. And the idea there is I shouldn't ask them about it because I'll make it worse. Another variation of this myth might be, if I ask them about suicide and they hadn't been thinking about it, maybe I've planted a seed. Now they're thinking about it. They weren't before, but now that I've said it, they are. And now I've worsened the situation. I've increased the risk because I said the word. I planted the seed. Please remember the unfortunate stat about 10-year-olds. It's highly unlikely that you'll be the first to say that word to them the first time they've encountered it. Okay. The reality of that is talking about it is a protective step. How I talk about it matters. Like if it can't be guilt tripping or manipulating or any of that. I mean, talking about it in a way that's safe and without judgment is a really big deal, but communication is a safety step. It can bring anxiety down. And maybe I could just ask you to kind of reflect on a time in your life that maybe you've had to keep a secret that was painful or you didn't want to keep a secret. And what a relief it is if somebody can just let you, share and be real and you're safe in that. No judgment or anything, but you can share. Maybe you've used alcohol and you've relapsed and you don't want anybody to know, or, what have you. Maybe you've had some questions about, your happiness in your marriage or whatever. And you can tell somebody there's relief. It's almost measurable in terms of decreased blood pressure. And as there's that kind of relief and anxiety goes down, the likelihood of an impulsive act also goes down. So it's a safety step. Silence is not safer. Can I just ask by quick show of hands, has anyone in the room encountered, whether you hold it or not, but have you encountered someone or the pervasive attitude that this just isn't something that we should talk about? We shouldn't be talking about this. Has anyone encountered that attitude? Okay, okay. Yeah, so it's pretty common. Lots of times when I'm doing online trainings, I do a lot of online trainings for Idaho Department of Health and Welfare. Lots of times when I do those trainings, I'll ask them to just enter the chat on that and it'll be yes. Like yes, 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 yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay, do we have some, okay, and people in the chat are saying yes to that? Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So if people watching online want to enter on that, that would be great. Because I'd love to hear. And if you want to share experiences or anything like that on the chat, that's great too. We'd love to hear it. So the last one, only experts can prevent. I don't think we need to spend a long time on that one. I'll just reference CPR. I don't have to be a healthcare expert to use CPR. I don't have to be a counselor or a behavioral health expert to use QPR. I just need to have the skills to build the bridge. Okay, so the bridge skills are what's needed. Now, before we go to the next slide, I just want to point out one thing. And this one is really important, okay? These myths, whether it's I believe that no one can stop a suicide, it's inevitable, it's a myth. The research doesn't have my back. If I believe that communicating about it increases risk, it's a myth. The research doesn't have my back. If I believe that only experts can prevent, it's a myth. The research doesn't have my back. If I believe any of those things, please notice they have one thing in common, and that is they tell us not to do anything. Yeah, question or yeah. Mhm. Right. Yeah. Okay. So I'm appreciative of the question, and I bet you're not alone with this. Nancy, I'm going to take a shot, and then do you want to take a shot at it too? Okay. Let me repeat. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to repeat the question so that people online that are attending virtually can hear it. So the question was, if I'm a teacher and I have a student in class who says, like a math class, and they're struggling, and they say something like, "I just want to die," as they're doing the homework or whatever, do I take that seriously? Do I actually talk to them about it? Do I say, hey, come on, it's not that bad? Am I accurately characterizing your question? Okay, so I'm going to respond through the lens of the training and what the research shows. And then obviously, depending on context and situation, there's stuff we have to decide about how best to do it. But the research overwhelmingly recommends that we take all signs seriously, and saying I want to die is a sign. Now you have to read the situation, if I'm watching football with my brothers and somebody throws an interception and they say, I'm just gonna die. They're talking about the football game, right? Like I won't get to watch football if I harass them about suicide in that situation. Get out of the room, let me continue the game. So like I have to know how to read a room that way and kind of the dynamic, but I should take that seriously. Now, a couple things that you said that I think are really important. One of the things that you said that does come up in the research that I noted only because of my own tendencies. So I can relate to what you said, and I noted it just because I needed to pay attention to the research. You should not try to talk somebody out of that feeling. You don't really feel that way. It's not really that bad. That's not the best practice, isn't to try to talk them out of how they feel. And in all likelihood, and Nancy, you can kind of guide me on this as well, but I think most of the time, if you have a conversation like that, it might result in, you know what, let's just kind of let the school counselor know, depending on your read on that. But you should confront it. I just heard you say that, and I really care about you. I care about how you're feeling far more than I care about math. So can I just ask you if let's just talk about that for a minute. And depending on the age, of course, you're going to have to be super sensitive to that and very careful about that. But in general, if somebody seems to be even remotely serious about that, I need to get the school counselor involved in that, because I might be outside my wheelhouse. I don't know how to navigate that in the safest possible way. So I want to be the safe connection. I want them to know they have a safe place where they can be real. I want them to know that I care about them. And then I want them to have someone with more insight or more training to kind of help them navigate whatever else is going on. Does that address it? Okay, that's great.
The one thing that it does too is it builds some trust. Maybe that individual, that kid wasn't at the time really thinking about it, but he knows now, or she knows now, that you can be a trusted person if they're ever in trouble. So it kind of plants that seed for safety.
That's a really big deal. And I think stylistically, we're all going to be individual on that, right? So I think if we can walk away with certain principles that are pretty clear in our head about what's best to do, and then figure out, so how does that work in my world with my style? How do I implement that? It's not going to look identical, but the underlying principle is I take it seriously, I connect, I get further information, and I try to connect them to further support. Okay, so that's a great question. The thing I'd like you to notice about these myths, and you go ahead to the next one if you want. They keep us passive when the person in the tunnel desperately needs us to be active. And that's the problem. Okay, we may believe things like there's nothing I can do, or it's not my place, or I shouldn't be up in their business. And when I believe that, that's not what the research shows. And I understand, in a school setting, I do want to just kind of comment on this so that I don't seem blind to it. There's questions of liability and what's the right thing to do. And that's why fostering good communication within schools so that people can kind of get on the same page about what the policies are is a really big deal, right? Because it would be easy to kind of blow it on a job level if you didn't understand what the protocols are. So those conversations are just really needed and super helpful. But it is important to recognize that safety first would be the thing, and I need to take all signs seriously. Okay, so this one I'm just going to hit to really quickly. Individuals with thoughts of suicide keep their plans to themselves. This is identified as a myth. Okay, it doesn't mean that they're going to explicitly come talk to me, but usually within a few weeks, and especially the week of an attempt, there's some indicator that something is off. Okay, it's not necessarily that I would automatically think of suicide, but there's some kind of indication. We'll talk more about this in the skills section in just a minute. Okay, so we're going to harken back to that. We don't need to belabor it here. The second one I'm going to ask you to raise your hands on again in just a second. Okay, so the second one is those who talk about suicide don't do it. lot of people believe that. That's a myth. Okay, so some people who make an attempt have talked about it. Some people haven't. We don't know who's going to do it. It is not at all an indicator that they won't do it because they've talked about it. But the thing that I would like to ask you about is this. Have any of you encountered the idea or heard someone say it's just attention seeking? They just want attention. They're talking about, okay, so that's something, okay. I'm seeing a lot of hands and nods. Okay. So if I could just plead with you to let that one go. If someone needs attention so badly that they're talking about suicide, give them attention. Something's wrong. You know, something is up. If they're really talking about that, they need something. And so ignoring them increases the risk of pain and isolation compounding. And so you connecting, they're heard, somebody cares, that's going to go a long way. Okay, so please don't. I know this is a super common one. It's the same thing I do on the chats in the virtual trainings that I do. I'll ask, you know, Nancy and I have observed that many, many times. That will say, have you encountered that attitude before? And almost everyone says yes. Okay, so we've had a lot on the chat line saying yes too. So this last one I think is kind of redundant. We've already, they kind of have it duplicated in different language. Once a person decides there's nothing anyone can do, and that's a myth. So just the beliefs and barriers section, just to kind of reinforce the core elements there. The reason why we do this is so that you can individually examine your attitudes toward it with the goal of empowering yourself to make the biggest difference for good that you can. And sometimes because we have a misconception, we rob ourselves of a lot of the capacity we have to do good because we think we shouldn't go there. And the research is contrary to that. We should go there. It is our business. We are in this together, and we can learn to do it sensitively and delicately and safely. And when we do that, we build stronger communities. Do you have another question? Yeah, go ahead. Please do. No, it's great. Do. Mhm. Yeah. Yep. I wish that weren't so familiar, but that is a reality that we face, isn't it? Okay, so for people online, let me just say what happens. The child expresses some kind of concern or indicates the need for connection. I connect with the child. I realize they're in danger or they seem not to be safe at home. I take them to the counselor. The counselor perhaps contacts Child Protective Services. Child Protective Services comes in. They have kind of criteria or protocols that they have to demonstrate align with the situation. Let's say the situation doesn't match up in some way. And so now the child's still at risk, and what happened because of that. That's a reality that is just, I mean, I wish I could say that it's intolerable, but I know that we face it sometimes. I do think two things, and then Nancy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. I'm going to reinforce the one point that Nancy made, and that is never underestimate the value of having that safe place. So you can continue to be a safe place for that child, and you can continue to provide that connection. So, and maybe you can even be transparent depending on age and so forth, but it might be like, I know that you have a lot of other parts of your life that I don't have anything to do with, but I want you to know you're safe here. I want you to know I care. And then I've had a lot of people email after various trainings saying, do you have additional links or additional resources? I just need more information. So sometimes you can find out about something like Upper Valley Child Advocacy, or you can find out if there are other resources. And I think, and you can tell me if I'm right, I think we have mandatory reporting, right? If we believe there's evidence, and you have reported, in that case, I've reported, But I think it opens up the door a little bit for you to at least seek further information and be legitimate in doing that. Yes, let's get it. Yeah, let's hear it. Wow. Mhm, 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 which is awesome. Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay, that is great news. That's great news. Okay, so I'm going to try to restate what you said for the people online really quickly. But first of all, thanks. That is a long time to be helping kids and so cool. So truly thank you for your commitment to children. And yeah, really, yeah, yeah, for real. Like that's just such a, I'm sure that it's incalculable, the difference that you've made. So I think that that's really cool. The other thing that's really nice to hear, and I'm confident this would be true in many instances, is that there's a protocol that you follow through on that attempts to maximize safety, but that you can't solve problems that lie outside your sphere of influence except to a point, right? You can address them, you can bring it into the foreground, but you can't control what happens with the information once it's shared. But that you mostly are finding positive outcomes. So just for the people online, we had a school counselor. She's been a counselor for 28 years, and she has had to interact with students who have had thoughts of suicide. She takes measures of contacting the parents, making a great effort to contact the parents, share information with them when there are misconceptions, conversations in an effort to correct misconceptions about attention seeking or other risk factors that might be mischaracterized in the mind of the parent occur. And very happily, and I'm going to share this in I do trainings at least weekly for Department of Health and Welfare, and I always try to thank them for the work they do, but I'm going to share, do you mind if I share that? That'll make their day. To hear positive comments like that about Child Protective Services is really, really great. So good experiences with Child Protective Services that this individual's had. So I think that's super, super helpful. And that idea that like when we communicate together, we start to learn more and we start to gain confidence about pathways that might be constructive for us. Comment over here, sure. Mhm. Yes, by law, we are to report. So if we believe a child is endangered, I don't have to be in a specialized role with that child. As an adult, if I've observed signs of harm, I'm asked to report and legally bound to report. So yeah, that's an important clarification. So we'll move on, and at this point, we're going to get into, and Nancy, if you're not completely occupied with the chat, are you? Okay, okay. So okay, so what we'll do. Yeah, yeah. I mean, she's heard it all before. She's tired of me. Um, okay, okay. If we're good, then I'll just keep rolling because you have a lot of insights that please jump in and share them because I don't want them to lose your insights. So with pathways and protections, this part is kind of heftier. I'm going to invite you. I don't know that you can get a good picture of this, so I'll have you let Tanny know after. If you wanted a picture of a couple of these slides, there's usually 4 that I recommend people take pictures of, but it might be kind of hard in the situation that we're in here. And so if you want pictures of the 4 slides that I say, these in particular, I think are helpful to have pictures of. If you request it of her, I can prepare those slides in a document and get them sent to you. Okay, so we could get those emailed back out to you. Let me just say before that, I am willing to walk a fine copyright line. when I do that. I have to be very careful with what I do, but I just think you need the information. So it's for personal use only. It assumes that you've attended. It's not to blast out or use in your own presentations. QPR would not be happy about that, and so forth. But I do think that we're going to hit some slides that it's just kind of nice sometimes to have them to reflect on. And so we'll move through. So pathways would refer to risk factors, protections would refer to safety factors, and we'll just go to the next slide. Now on this next slide, if I can have you interpret that gold bar, look at that gold bar, and let's assume that the gold bar represents our will to live. Okay, so this gold bar represents our will to live, and we always want that bar, if at all possible, we want that gold bar to be pointing up. We want it to be pointed toward safety, toward future, toward possibility, toward purpose, toward hope. We want that gold bar pointing up, if at all possible. But we know that we have things that are going to push down on it. We're going to have risk factors. And really, risk factors could be anything that creates a sense of pain and isolation. Okay, or just intense pain, or lots of other things. But risk factors, we're going to go through these in more detail. We'll have a slide on risk factors. But there will be things that push down on our will to live. And if I were to write a word above risk factors, it would be manage. Okay, it would be manage. We all have risk factors. It's a question of, do we have the skills and support needed to manage those risk factors? Okay, and then we also want to be very attentive to the protective factors. That can buoy us back up. That can shore up that gold bar, that can keep it pointing up, that can strengthen it. Okay, and this would be things like relationships or resources or, practices that we might adopt in order to keep ourselves hopeful and strong and resilient. Okay, and so if we go to the next slide, this is one that I normally would ask people to take a picture of because I think it's complex and nice to be able to review it. This is a really complicated slide, so I'm going to try and walk you through it. Like I said, if you can get a picture of it, please do, but we can send those out if we need to. This would be the pathway slide. This would be a bunch of risk factors that you're going to see identified on this slide. And if we start on the left-hand side of that slide, you're going to see fundamental risk factors. And then if we go here, we have biological factors. Okay, so we have a track of biological factors. These are not meant to be all-inclusive lists. They're sampling, right? They're just illustrating some of the factors that would fit the biological track. We have a psychological track and then an environmental track. And I'm calling those pressure pathways because they can create pressure. They can push against our will to live. Okay, and so if we could just really quickly, I want you to notice a couple of things, especially about these two tracks. The biological track. These are conditions that aren't going to change. Remember how I mentioned earlier, unlovable, unsolvable, pain unbearable? The unsolvable part. If I have a genetic predisposition, say, to depression, or I'll use an example of a student that recently graduated. He shared a lot about his bipolar disorder with me. And he said when he was first diagnosed, he was in 9th grade. And he slipped into despair about the diagnosis. His family was sort of medicine averse. And so it was hard for him to kind of get what he needed and feel like it was not overly dependent or weak. And so he would take his meds and then he would get kind of stabilized and then he would go off the meds and he would spiral. And during the spirals, he would frequently have thoughts of suicide. And then he would go back on his meds and he would stabilize. And he said, I had to get to the point that I changed the way I thought about my meds. Instead of being weak and dependent, I had to realize it's strong and freeing for me to take my meds. It takes strength for me to take them, and they're freeing because I am now free to be the man I want to be, to become the person I want to be. I was super happy. I saw him outside my classroom door a couple days ago. He's graduated and everything, but I was like, oh, hey. And here he is, happy, doing his thing. And but the thing that you notice about this is he'll be managing that particular thing his whole life, right? That's not, wishing it away isn't managing it. And so being real with himself and then figuring out what is a life-affirming solution was very constructive for him. LGBTQ, sexual orientation, gender identity questions. super painful and isolating, can be really, really painful and isolating. Don't have to be, but often are. Very, very often are. They're not going away. If I feel like I have to solve that problem by not being in that category, I'm going to be in a world of hurt, painful and isolating. Okay. Race, age, we could have a long list of these things, but the point is, we have a lot of conditions that are conducive to pain and isolation, and they're hard to manage. And the biological track is really important to notice because these are conditions that they're part of who we are individually. And so we're going to have to learn how to manage those things. Personal psychological factors, let's just go through some of the items on the list here. Okay. Child abuse, if I've been neglected, if I've had verbal abuse or emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, kiddos that have that experience jump to a higher likelihood of thoughts of suicide. Not surprising, but that happens, right? I could throw sexual assault in there. 1 in 3 to 4 women, 1 in 6 men, apt to be sexually assaulted. Again, super hard to communicate about, often blamed, misplaced shame associated with that, higher thoughts of suicide. Loss of a parent. This could be, like we already referenced, 1 in 16 Idahoans will lose a parent or sibling by the time they're 18. But loss of a parent's a really big deal. I just read a survey, just barely, about millennials and Gen Zers who have lost a parent. Okay, so before 18. And the average time that was reported by those individuals to feel a sense of happiness about the future and to feel a sense of future was 6 years. Okay, so it's a long time. And all of the 30% of them said that it's never okay. Like it's never just okay. It never feels okay. Like there's still a lot of life that can be good, but it doesn't feel okay. And then they reported that the majority of them reported that support tapered off after a couple of months. And many reported that it tapered off after a week. Now that's not a blame thing, that we don't know what to do. We're doing the best that we know how to do. But the point is, people are going through a lot of stuff and they feel pretty isolated with it sometimes. Okay, so it could be loss of a parent to death, especially if it's by suicide, very high risk. Okay, it could be loss of a parent to divorce, where the emotional dynamic is really disrupted. And so there's a lot of work to do to make sure that people are getting what they need and they still feel cared about, and there's not a lot of blame, and people aren't just torn apart by those kinds of divisions that occur sometimes. It could be loss of a parent to relapse, where their emotional availability just isn't the same as it was because they're struggling to recover again, potentially. Okay, it could be loss of a parent to incarceration, but that's a big deal. Culture shock or shift. Now this can obviously be, I come from another culture, I speak a different language, it's hard to feel like I belong and I'm connected, but I'm just going to use an example if I could, and I'm going to choose Child Protective Services just as a for instance. I could choose police, I could choose school counselors, I bet. Okay, so you go to work and you're dealing with really hard things that other people don't see, things that don't necessarily have solutions either, like things that it's like I can do my best and I don't know that I'm going to change the outcome too much. And so you're seeing all this, you see it, you have the memories of it, you have the feeling for it, and you go home. It's not that your family doesn't love you, they just didn't see what you saw day after day. They don't get it because they didn't do it. They weren't there with you to observe it. And so it can be like, why are you in a bad mood all the time when you come home from work? I mean, you're really down. And it's like, okay, so like that culture shock and shift can be real. Religion is here. It's also in the protective factors. Religion is very individual. For some people, religion is a source of hope and solace and strength. And it's on the protective slide for that reason. But it's also, for some, it's not. For some, it's a feeling of unworthiness or shame or lack of belonging or I'm never good enough or pressure. And if that's the case, then it becomes a risk factor, or can. The student that I mentioned who talked to me about not wanting to go on a mission was definitely experiencing a great deal of anxiety and pressure and pain over that. That can happen, right? Drugs and alcohol. So the personal and psychological factors are a big deal. And then the environmental factors. So the time of year, how long is winter in Idaho? I'm sure we're looking forward to another one beginning, and when will it end, right? Like, I mean, this can be kind of hard here. Yeah, right? It'll start soon. Enjoy the colors while you have them because it'll soon be white. But rural stuff, it's hard to get places. It's hard, it's hard to get to resources. It's hard to get to social circles that may be robust or whatever. Like it's hard. And so what happens here, and this is the part to really attend to, these pressure pathways are full of different elements of our lives that can be painful and isolating, and they can flare and they can fade, and there's multiple factors going on at once. But what happens, if you can look at the column of circles here in the center, what happens is when you have an experience that's called a trigger or a final straw on this slide, crisis in a relationship, I'm going through a divorce and I'm not seeing my kids as much as I wish I were. Or I just lost custody of my kids and I'm just kind of freaking out about that. Or my boyfriend broke up with me. Or I'm being bullied at school. Or we could add a long, long list, right? What happens is because of the pressure pathways, hopelessness can amplify. It can amplify. It gets so much bigger because that pressure just amplifies the hopelessness so big and so thick that we sometimes lose our path. We can't see it. We can't see past the hopelessness associated with the trigger. So it could be a crisis in a relationship. It could be a loss of freedom. This could even be financial freedom. It could be a fear of punishment, kind of the inverse of freedom in a way. Okay, and if I may, please keep in mind those ages on that loss slide, because what feels like a loss of freedom to a 10-year-old is going to be really different than to that 25-year-old, right? And so I really want the crisis in the relationship to the 10-year-old versus the 37-year-old. You've got to be other-centered, individual, other people when you're thinking about this, okay? Fired or expelled, a serious illness or a major loss, like maybe I am going to get evicted, I'm going to lose my home, or my car is going to be repossessed, or I have to move to a new environment. Student comes to BYU, Idaho from Los Angeles without a car. They're in Rexburg. Wow. What do? You can only ride the Walmart bus so many times and then sort of loses its luster. So now I'm left with what? Okay, that's hard, right? That's a loss of friend groups back home, loss of the beach where I used to go jog and find my hope again. What do I do? Yeah, comment here. Yeah, please. Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Social media plays a role for sure, but it's interesting because in the survey we need to create a component to this training that's not in QPR because social media can be positive or negative depending. The overuse of social media, the one thing that I've seen in a lot of articles about it is that it often leaves people with two big issues. One is that their self-esteem or their value seems to be externally driven, and so it's not from inside out, it's from outside in, and I can't control that or do anything about that. And so that makes social media not a good place for me to try to derive my value, purpose, sense of self. And that can leave somebody feeling really isolated and alone. Yeah, yeah. Yes. 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 Yeah. And if I can, in fact, maybe if you're not in a rush after, could we just talk for just a minute? Because Nancy and I have talked about it, and it's in my notes of we need to build something about social media because in the post-training survey, almost everybody says they wouldn't use it. And I understand the negative uses, but there's also a lot of good resources that you can access by using it. And so it's not built into the QPR curriculum, but you're on to something that is very, very vital. Let's touch base after. Is that okay? Not as an avoidance thing either. Okay, let's hear it.
So the question is, how do we as parents and educators help bridge or assist the gap in feeling culture shock or immersion into a new area?
Okay. That one's a really hard one, I think. Like, how do you, yeah, oh, thanks. I'll do my tap dance and you'll wind up with nothing. No. So I think that can be really, really hard. I think especially, I know sometimes when you move into a religious community, you're not part of that religion, that can feel isolating unintentionally on the part of everyone, I'm sure, but like that can just, when it drives a community to the point that it often does, that can be really tough. I'm going to use one example, and then I guess people can kind of try to figure out how to individualize this maybe from the example, but I did a training. It wasn't actually a suicide prevention training, but it was a training for a Native American population up in northern Idaho. And they started talking about the risks that they feared that their kids faced when they left for college. Like if they go away to college and they leave the reservation, and we're so worried about them. There's so many different things that can affect them negatively. And so they were talking about finding those things that were part of their culture or part of their connection to family that they could take with them or that they could honor, to find their own defining things that they could honor. And so they would send like candles that had sage fragrance, and they went through a lot of different things that they would try to send with their kids or encourage their kids to engage in so that they didn't feel so completely culturally isolated when they left the reservation and went away to school. It was super interesting, like these kinds of blankets. And I mean, it was just like really, really cool to listen to them talk about how they would try to create a safe environment. I would say two things in general might be helpful in response to the question. I think if you can find those things that are like core to what make you feel good, and then look for any level of common ground. It may not be religious or whatever, but any level of common ground that become a place that you can connect or intersect with people in the community, that might start to build a sense of, belonging and connection there. And then I would also find ways of preserving the things that are most valuable and honoring those, and in a way that isn't dependent on outside identity either. Not segregating yourself, but just that it's a validating thing for you, and you bring something to the table and you find the common ground that you can find. That doesn't mean I'm just leaving what's mine to be part of what's theirs, but I'm finding the places that we intersect. That can be really important. Okay, so we're moving on. We've got 15 minutes left, so we're going to be cruising through these skills. They're not hard to learn, they're just hard to do. Okay, so the skills are hard to do. This is a slide that's really important. So if you do take a picture of it, I will send this to you. I'm going to be using this slide in just a minute when we get into the skills section, but this is the protective wall. Let me quickly, very, very quickly hit the three things on here, and then know that I'm going to refer back to this in just a minute. So if you have a picture, that'll be good. You have three dimensions of safety. Please be conscious of them. Okay, really conscious of them. On the far left, you have limit access to lethal means. I want to say right up front, this is not an anti-gun presentation, but it is a pro-safety presentation. If I have guns in my home, do I have locks? Do I have them in a locked cabinet? If I have someone in my home who's struggling, do I have a best friend or someone who could hold on to my firearms for us? We recently did a training at Guns and Gear in Idaho Falls, and he said he had a longtime customer come in with his rifles, and he said, hey, I'm worried about my teenage son right now. Can you hang on to my rifles for me? I don't want them in the house. And he said, I eagerly said, yes, I would love to do that for my customers anytime. Your safety matters. I'll just come back for them when you're ready, but they're safe with me here. Okay, men in our country are 3.4 to 3.6 times more likely to die by suicide because they're more likely to use a firearm. Immediate access to lethal means is an indicator of how likely you are to survive a crisis. You're not as likely to survive a crisis when you use a firearm. That life after crisis likelihood goes way down when I use lethal means. So we just have to be safe. We have to be really intelligent about the many uses that a firearm can have, and it accomplishes its purpose well. And so I have to be conscious of that. What about my medicine? Do I have unnecessary meds in my med cabinet? I need to take them to a drug take back. Take them to a drop box. Just don't have it around. You know, what am I doing with my meds? If I do have to have them around, how am I securing them so that they wouldn't be misused? Okay, so I really want to create a safe environment at home. This wall of protection we'll come back to, but if you've got a picture, that'll be good. Sobriety is the foundation. I'm more likely to make erratic decisions if I'm not sober. But all of these little rectangles on here represent bricks in a wall that can keep me safe, but they're very individual. Okay, so maybe I have best friends. That's good. If my best friends aren't good for me, then that's not good, right? Responsibility for children can be very positive, but it isn't always. Some people, like we trained someone who was in the recovery community. She said, if I were to relapse, my kids would not be a safety factor because I would feel like who would ever do this to her kids? Who would put drugs before children? They would be better off without me. She said, that's just where my head goes. It may not be true, but that's where my head goes. So if I want to stay safe, that's not the track of thought that's going to keep me safe. Okay. And for others, it's exactly the opposite. Okay. So it's really individual here. Difficult access to means we've talked about medication compliance. If I need to have a support group, whether it's pornography addiction or alcohol or, narcotics, meth, I'm going to find I cannot do that alone. I'm very unlikely to be successful. If I try to do that all by myself, find a connection. Okay. Do I have a pet? We trained a guy recently who said that his dog kept him alive while he struggled through his alcohol use from like the age of 16 to 21. Dogs are awesome that way. You have the worst day possible. You come home and they're like, hi, oh, someone loves me. Anyway, he said, I knew my dog would be there. It's a big deal. It doesn't take a bunch to stay safe, enough. The more you have, the better, right? But this protection is a big deal. And then resiliency, you see at the bottom, would be like, get outside, do some physical activity, be creative, pick up your guitar. You haven't played it for a while. Try some woodwork again. Go take some photographs, journal. Creative outlets are really strong in terms of relationship to resiliency. So it's a big deal. What does this look like if I'm trying to plan a safety thing? I know I'm going to go talk to a friend. I know my friend is struggling. So I'm going to say, hey, let's walk your dog while we walk by the river tonight. I can bring with intentionality, I can bring resiliency and safety into those engagements with people that are struggling. And I can draw more good out of that moment by being intentional about how I handle it. Okay, so we'll go on to the next one now. Okay, skills in action. So we're going to move through this, but I want to hit certain points very hard. Okay, so first skill. If someone were in that tunnel of pain and isolation, would I recognize it? I need to say at this point and emphasize hard, there is a great deal of misplaced self-blame in relation to this issue. So before we go into the skills, we're not trying to go back to the past and do what if or if only. This is not about that. You are not responsible for a choice someone else made. You are not responsible for information you didn't have. This is a forward-looking training. We're just trying to get better at it. It's not easy to be a person among people. We don't know how to do it very well. Sometimes we're trying to get better at it. That's it. So I might get better at recognizing signs. So if we go to the next one, there's 3 kinds of signs we're interested in: verbal clues, behavioral clues, and situational clues. So I might hear someone say, I've decided to kill myself, or I'm going to commit suicide, or I'm going to end it all. If I hear someone say something like that, I've got to slow down, let it register. I just heard someone say they were going to kill themselves. Do they mean it? I'll never know if I don't learn how to ask. I've got to communicate about it. Okay, if we'll go to the next one. Sometimes the clues are less direct. Sometimes they're indirect. I'm tired of life. I can't do it anymore. Okay, I just want out. I won't be around much longer. Pretty soon you won't have to worry about me. Okay, I hear those kinds of comments. Register it. Okay, because I can misread it. Let's say that you have a kid that's going off to college pretty soon. You've been in a conflict. You're fighting, storms out, slams the door. I'm not even going to be around much longer. Are they talking about the fact that they're leaving for college? Or are they talking about something else? How do I know? I have to ask. I have to communicate. It's so important that we communicate. Okay, so communication is a big one, and we're communicating in a way that creates safety, not judgment, not manipulation, not guilt tripping. You matter. Safety. Okay, next slide. On this one, behavioral clues. We can move through this kind of quickly. If somebody's made a previous attempt at suicide, we need to tune into that. Okay, they're capable of taking the action. We've talked about guns and pills. We've got to be aware of what's there. Okay, if we see a different kind of behavior with that, we want to tune into that. If there's co-occurring stuff, and you saw the pathways, the pressure pathways, there's always co-occurring stuff between the biological, the personal experience stuff, and the environment. Like there's a lot going on. Layers of pain are dangerous. Putting personal affairs in order. Okay, a trainee recently shared an experience of someone from high school calling to say, hey, I just wanted to call and say thanks for everything you did for me back in high school. She said, it was a sad story. She said, I did not think suicide. I'm just like, you're welcome. Like, it was fun hanging out. That was a good time of life. Okay. She said, I never thought suicide. And why would she? There's no blame in her not thinking of suicide in that situation, but she cared and wanted to get better at it. She said, I just didn't, I would want to know that I could catch that if I could. Okay, giving away prized possessions. Why did your 25-year-old give away his favorite guitar? Why is your buddy giving you his favorite watch? Okay, why? What's going on? You love this watch. Why are you giving it to me? Conversation, communication, got to ask. Okay, sudden interest or disinterest in religion, drugs or alcohol with relapse, especially super dangerous. Okay, unexplained anger, aggression, irritability, or almost a kind of euphoric happiness that's not really grounded. Like, oh, I don't have to deal with this. I'm going to solve this by not having to deal with it. And you have kind of not a grounded, but a sense of kind of unusual, euphoric kind of happiness. Ask. Signs are important. Okay, next slide. These are situational clues, and this is really repetitious from the column of triggering events. It's almost all the same, so I'm just going to really quickly rename them. Being fired or expelled, an unwanted move, the loss of a relationship, death of a spouse, child, or friend, especially if it's by suicide. Okay, the diagnosis of an illness, loss of freedom, fear of punishment, loss of financial security. Notice loss, 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 loss. Loss is painful and it can be isolating. Loss of a teacher, cherished therapist, counselor, and the fear of becoming a burden. So these are situations that are inherently dangerous. I have to learn to communicate through them. Okay, so then what do I do? Let's say I see some of these signs. So now I have to take the next step, which is to ask. I see it, so now I have to say it. Go on to the next one, please. Research shows I have to use the word suicide or something akin to that. I can't just say, so are you thinking of hurting yourself? That's better than asking nothing, but it's not concrete enough to give you the information that you need to know how best to help. Okay, I might be indirect in my approach. So I talk to them about being happy and so forth, and then I work into the question about suicide. I want to ask in a way that creates safety. You seem really sad, and I care about you. You matter to me. And, you know, sometimes when people are going through the kind of thing you're going through, they have thoughts of suicide. It's not unusual. And I really care about you. So have you had those thoughts? Not, never do that to me, or care more about your parents than that, or surely you wouldn't, you know, you have more appreciation for your children. No. I care about you. You matter. Have you had those thoughts? Are you thinking about suicide? Okay, a direct approach can be as direct as, if we go here to the third one, if we switch to this, are you thinking about killing yourself is considered a best practice way of asking. We can go to the next slide. But the thing that is important here is I'm going to ask about suicide, and I'm going to ask in a non-judgmental, safe, compassionate way. When I do it, I'm going to ask when I have the feeling to ask. I'm not going to wait. And I'm going to show respect for their dignity, autonomy, and privacy. I'm not going to be put out that I have to listen to them. I'm not going to roll my eyes. I'm not going to tell them, oh, whatever, you're just being dramatic. It's not going to matter if I'm talking to the student who is talking to me and she's bisexual. I'm respecting the fact that she is who she is, and that's beside the point. I'm listening to her. Doesn't make any difference to how important she is. Okay. If I were doing CPR, I would not pause while I'm doing CPR to talk to the person about their diet or exercise patterns. I would keep them alive, right? Okay, same thing here. This is life first. It's all about the life of the person. It does not matter. None of that other stuff is relevant right then. Okay. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so once we've asked, if the answer is yes, and we're about 4 minutes from done. Okay, can we do 4 more minutes? We good for about 4? Okay. So now what do? This can be a place where anxiety jumps a little bit. Okay, it can be stressful, like, oh no, what do? They just said yes, and I'm not trained. I want to stay composed. I want to be calm. And it helps me, if we'll go to the next slide, it helps me to have a structure in my mind. If you want to take a picture of this slide, that's fine. I'm happy to send it out if you prefer. Okay, it's nice to know that I have this structure, because then I can stay safe and on point in the conversation, because it can be emotional and you can really get, pulled into a rabbit hole. and I don't want to when I'm using these skills. So I'm going to give my full attention. Okay, cell phone's down. I'm not checking my watch. I'm with you. I'm present. Okay, I'm going to let the person talk freely. That's sometimes easier said than done. I'm not going to slip into advice mode. I'm not going to, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? Like, none of that. No, they're talking freely. And that might be hard because they might be talking about something that's hard for me to hear. If I'm talking to my child about the fact that, you know, he got his girlfriend pregnant, that's going to be hard for me to hear. If I'm talking to my child about the fact that they used heroin, that's going to be hard for me to hear. If my close friend is telling me about sexual assault, that's going to be hard for me to hear. I'm going to listen and let them talk freely, but third point is really important. I am not the expert. So remember, pain rarely produces hope. I'm not diving further into the painful topic than they offer. I'm listening, I'm empathizing, I'm affirming their value, but the deep dive conversation is for the person with more skills than I have. I don't dive further in. Pain won't produce hope. So what am I doing? If you remember the slide with the protective wall, I am listening for any protective factor. Anything they care about can be a protective factor. So I'm listening for anything. You have a dog? I didn't know you have a dog. What kind of dog do you have? Oh, you like fish? Where's your favorite spot? You play guitar? What kind of music do you play? Oh, you get together with your buddies and play Call of Duty every Thursday night? That's awesome. I don't know what Call of Duty is, but that sounds cool. Doesn't matter if I know what it is. They like it. It's community. Okay, so I'm listening anything that they care about, and I'm going to affirm it. Okay, so I'm really engaged in this conversation, listening for things that might be sources of hope or purpose to them, anything that they care about. Things they care about, bring them back to present and give them control. They can do those things. Okay, that can crack that tunnel open just a little bit. And then when I can kind of sense the emotion shifting, maybe it's de-escalated a little bit, on the basis of what they care about, I can try to point them toward life. So it can be, I know you're in a lot of pain and the stuff is real, but it seems like you still have some things you care about. It seems like these people still matter to you. So maybe it's worth staying alive for now. If they're not there yet, I keep listening. If they are there yet, then cool. Now I can connect to help. Next slide. And I think go to, just go to. Yeah. As I connect to help, my preferred way is to be physically present with them. I want to maximize connection as I provide the help. So I'm going to be physically present with them on the way to the counselor. If there's a situation where they're not safe, they've got a firearm, they're agitated, it's 911 call. Safety first. I'm not in the same room with them. Okay, but if I can be with them, I will. If that's not possible for me, then I'm going to make arrangements. So like if somebody's on campus, it might be, hey, your roommate's going to be home in 5 minutes, and then he's going to walk you to the counseling center. He'll go with you there. Just promise me he'll open the door when he knocks. Okay, and then the last one is I give referral information, and I encourage them to use it, try to get a commitment from them to use the referral information. Okay, so I'm maximizing connection as they do the difficult thing of getting help. Now there's one last slide that you'll want a picture of. And Nancy, I'm going to have you talk through this one if that's okay. So we have a lot of resources. Sometimes people aren't aware of them. We're like 2 minutes from done, but you're going to want this information.
Yeah, so obviously if it's a critical situation, then, 911 law enforcement will need to be called. But there's a lot of other resources out there available. I work in the adult world. And, one of the things Andra's been so great to kind of have it be for kids and adults. But I want to stress, look out for your coworkers. This can apply to them and dealing with them. The Center for Hope where I work is located right next to the Crisis Center, back behind Fred Meyer. And that place is a place that people can go if they're having suicidal thoughts or ideations. It's free. If you have Medicaid or you have insurance, you can use that, but nobody will be turned away. It's a step down from taking somebody to the emergency room. If the person wants to go to the emergency room, great. Get them to the emergency room to be evaluated. If they're worried about maybe getting locked up or they want to be able to just, not go through that process, the Crisis Center is another option. At the Crisis Center, there's medical professionals, on duty 24 hours a day, as well as case managers. A lot of people with drug and alcohol issues, they'll go there to detox rather than go to the hospital. It's a softer, easier way than going to the hospital. And also there's an amnesty box there. If anybody comes in and say they have any drug paraphernalia or substances, illegal substances, you can walk through that door, you can put it in that amnesty box, you won't be charged. But I encourage people to utilize, if you know of anybody, family members, coworkers, utilize the crisis center. The Center for Hope's next door too. We have recovery coaches. People can come in there and we can talk to you about, a family member or yourself about dealing with some substance abuse issues. So.
You've got a question.
No, one of the, Andrew talked about the state plan. There is a state plan to have crisis centers for adolescents. Not presently.
Yeah, so it's in process. I know that I have had a number of students that I've known, some in my class and others not, but that go to the crisis center that have gone there. That 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 with privacy, highly respected, and it being voluntary can be a very attractive option for people that are kind of skittish about it or scared. It can be a really, really, and so many people don't know about it. You have a comment or question? Sure, let's grab it.
The nearest crisis center, you're in there's one in Twin Falls, yeah. Yeah, that's where you got to get, your local community has to kind of get creative. Maybe using the phone, doing phone calls to the hotlines. There's also telehealth available now with a lot of agencies, so they can reach out into those rural areas.
But I do want to comment on that because you are in a very tough spot. I mean, it is so difficult, and our transportation issues are complex. And so, I mean, I am sorry that you're in that spot, and it's just hard. It is harder. You're in a tougher spot for sure when it comes to access to help. Yeah, question. You want to comment on that? Okay, so I've read about that, but I don't feel qualified to comment on its efficacy and so forth. I know it's a good thing. I've read about it, but I don't know enough to feel like I can comment with any kind of expertise on that. I'm sorry. Okay, so really quickly, I know we're out of time here, so let me just quickly review. You have in your hands a paper with a QR code to a post-training survey. I am reporting this data to not only our Region 7 public health leaders, but also I share it with Idaho Department of Health and Welfare suicide prevention team. They're very appreciative of the data. Cool things are happening because of the data that we're gathering. And there's a lot of shared effort now. I just received an email about sharing it with some of the QPR that's happening in schools across the state and collecting data in common. So there's a lot we're trying to learn in order to be more effective with this. I'm hopeful that at the end of this training, you'll complete that survey. To summarize what we've covered, we talked about QPR and CPR, our point being that just as CPR is a bridge skill between crisis and help, so QPR can also be a bridge skill where you identify someone in crisis and help them cross that divide in order to connect with the help they need to try and stay safe. The goal is to extend life beyond crisis. In Idaho, our losses are too high and very diverse in terms of age range. We want to individualize our connecting with people in an effort to help. We have beliefs sometimes that are contrary to what the research shows, and those beliefs tend to keep us passive. The goal is to become active, to have the skills that would give us the confidence and ability to help, and so actively use them. Pathways and protections, we talked about 3 pressure tracks, the biological, psychological, and environmental pressure pathways that can amplify feelings of hopelessness when we have a triggering event. We've also talked about the see, say, do skills, recognizing that someone may be in crisis through their verbal clues, direct or indirect, their behavioral clues, or the situational context that they're in. That can help us recognize the need to ask. We want to ask specifically about suicide. We might do it indirectly and kind of work into it, or we might be straightforward right out the mouth. You know, are you thinking about killing yourself? but we've got to ask. We want to normalize it as we ask so they don't feel like they're weird for having those thoughts or that it's not okay to have those thoughts. It's okay and they matter. We just want to help. And then finally, we're listening for protective factors, affirming those factors, and on the basis of what matters to them, encouraging them to stay alive for now and connect to help. And you should have now a lot of numbers or resources that you're at least available for to use. So if you're in that conversation, you don't have to be frantic or getting online. You can just say, you know, I've got some numbers right here. Let's just explore it. Okay, and the goal is then, if you're willing to do that, to create the opportunity for you to be a safe connection. And it's not overstating it to say that bridge skill is a life-saving skill set. Thank you so much for your time and questions today. Sorry that we ran over by a couple minutes, but I hope you have a great day. It's been a privilege to be here with you. I'm not in a rush. If you've got questions, we can stay and answer them, but thank you again for your time and investment.